Now I want to talk about a specific styling use case, the idea of styling a host element. Now in the last lesson, we looked at if we jump into our inspect, we can see that we have our div class donut-card, which is then declared inside of our donut card component. However, the way that we declare the donut card component is by doing exactly this. So essentially we get an additional element because I've chosen to start this containing div to wrap all of our contents and then apply some styles such as flexbox. You may find yourself doing something like this, or at least wanting to do something like this, where we have the ability to target an element. For example, we could target a div and apply some styles. We could also do the same with an h1, p tags, and so forth. Now, the fact that we are using Angular means we are using custom elements. So we could do something like this, donut card, and we could then add some styles such as border, 4 pixels, solid, and red. We can then hit save, and you can see that on the right, we now have some strange looking card. Now, this is because the donut card is by default not a display block item. So if we change this over, you now see that we have something like this, which looks definitely a lot nicer. Let's say we then move this donut card into a completely different component, somewhere completely separate, and used it in another module perhaps. We would then have to write this code all over again. So my question to you is, how do we style this component without having to write the styles in the parent component each time? The answer is in a host selector. We can grab our styles here and go back to an empty array. We'll save this out. We can see our styles disappear. Jumping back into our donut card, we can, at the top of our styles array, paste in our donut card. We can simply say colon and then host. Now this isn't Angular specific. This is part of the Shadow DOM specification, which is a newer feature of the web platform. So if we demonstrate this, we can save it out. Our red outlines are back. If we then jump into our inspect, you can see that when we click the donut card itself, we now have the host on its own. You can see that ng-host. So we know that that is the host element. And I briefly did mention this host and this ng content in the previous lesson. So now you understand what a host is. Now you understand as well what the content of the host is. So this will definitely make your styling practices far easier. And it might be that you can in fact use things such as flexbox. And as your Angular skills grow, you'll be able to use them with inputs and then pass in different classes and then change the styling depending on a particular scenario or scenarios. So with this in mind, what we could in fact do is take our logic inside of here, copy it, and remove it from our donut card selector. So why might we want to do this? We could in fact go and delete the div on the bottom and then simply leave our template like this. This then renders things out, which means that we could jump into our host and do something like this instead. So now we are actually applying the styles to the host element instead of this div that we are using inside. Instead of having a containing div, we are now not having a root element. We're starting things off with an image and finishing with a second child element as a div. In previous versions of Angular and also some other frameworks and libraries, it's imperative to keep that wrapping div, so this allows us to essentially skip it should we wish. Now it's up to you whether you want to adopt this approach. I think this is quite a nice way for us to style things. Depending on what you want to achieve, you can see that when we hover over here, we are in fact moving the donut card element, whereas before we had that red border, if you remember, and then if we were to hover, it's actually the div inside that's then moving. So this allows us to have a bit more control over the layout. We can then start talking to and painting some styles directly to our host, which means that we could in fact just keep our selectors very, very simple. We could say we want to have just an image selector, a p tag selector, perhaps a slightly modified version. The important thing to remember is we need this display flex or a display block because a custom element which Angular implements, this donut-card, none of them are display block or flex by default. So that's one thing that we need to remember, and we do get the benefit of automatically having a display block when we use a div because they have a user agent style sheet with a default value of display block. So we'll wrap it up there. That is how to style a host element, and I hope this will help you solve many of your problems down the line as you come to create more complex layout.